God bless you, House of Worship family. I'm glad you guys are here today with us to join us on a special day to bringing awareness to something that's very dear to my heart, autism. This is an event that's just going to edify you, give you guys the clarity how to see things in a different light when you see a child with autism. And we have a great speaker that's going to be here to speak with us. My wife's been going beyond to get this event going because I know it was a lot of hard work. And I'm just grateful that she made this happen. Our pastors made this happen by giving us this location. And you guys made this happen. And our speaker making this happen, coming here today to just share his knowledge with us. But enough about how I feel. Let me introduce you to my wife, Joanna, so she could express her feelings.
Hi. Well, good evening and welcome. And thank you so much for being here with us and watching online. For those of you that are going to watch online, well, first of all, we want to say thank God for the opportunity for allowing us this event to take place and for our speaker to be here and the audience and everyone that is going to watch. A lot of you may know or do not know that we do have a little boy, Mason, who was diagnosed autistic when he was 2.5. So this topic today, autism awareness, is very dear to my heart and it means a lot to us. But I feel that events like this are very important because we do need to communicate as educate ourselves, as a community members, as church family, as a person of what's going on in regards to autism. I'm gonna share a little quick story real quick. I go to a hairdresser and I'm getting my hair done and I see a little boy that runs into the hair salon. Mind you, my little boy is already autistic, so I tend to sense when I see a little boy that has it. So this little boy runs in. He's about maybe 6 or 7. He's high functioning, meaning that, he's very alert. He speaks, but he's running around. He tried to take a water bottle from a lady. He's on the phone. He sits up. He's all over the place. And, I sense him, but I don't say nothing. I get my roller set. And then he went with his mom to get a haircut. So I'm just checking everything. My hairdresser, mind you, she's a sweetheart. She has a humongous heart. She goes, "Oh my goodness, you move so much. Sit down, stay still." The mom put her head down. The little boy, he's clueless. And I'm looking. And it just touched me how ill-informed us as a community we are when it comes to autism. So then the boy is getting a haircut. I'm in front of him, so I'm like praising him. "Hey, high five, you're doing a good job, yeah." And he's looking at me. The mom is looking at me, but she doesn't say nothing. When they leave, it's my turn to get my hair done. And I tell the hairdresser, I say, "Hey, do you know that boy is under the spectrum? He's autistic." She's like, "No. Don't tell me that. Are you serious? Oh my goodness, I feel so bad." And I said, it's okay, but just for you to know that every child that doesn't behave well in public, that doesn't mean that they're misbehaving. So 2 weeks come by, and my hairdresser tells me, "Joanna, it's true. He was autistic." And I was like, "Don't feel bad because you didn't know." So this is why events like this are important for us to get educated, to know that every child that behaves bad in the street doesn't behave bad because he wants to, So I'm just excited to be here. I just needed to share that little story. And I thank you guys, and I hope that we all learn something from tonight and share the word. Yes. All right? Yes. So with no further ado, please, let's introduce our speaker, who is Mr. Jonathan Plaza. He is a plus because he is Colombian, right? He speaks English and Spanish. and he will be educating us when it comes to the a little bit of mental health and autism, and he has a lot of goodies to share with us. So welcome and thank you, and have fun.
Mic check, mic check. Are we on? Yep. Are we on? Thank you guys. Thank you guys for being here with me today. And thank you so much for Joanna for just creating this opportunity for us so we can be here and share information that may be useful to families. I want to first start with, if we can, Gio, if you can help me move the slide to the next, because I don't see it here. So, yeah, because what I see here is the videos. Okay, beautiful. So first of all, I'm gonna give you a little bit of background information on myself. Again, my name is Jonathan Plaza. I've been in the field of behavior analysis now for a little bit over 13 years. I started in 2009. I am a bachelor. I received my bachelor's degree from Florida International University, where I graduated from psychology. I also attended the University of Miami, where I obtained my master's in special education. And currently, I am a doctorate student, Doctor of Psychology at my PsyD from University of Arizona. Thank you. Beautiful. So I'm obtaining my Doctor of Psychology degree, where I look to expand on behavior analysis and hopefully apply the science in other areas outside of autism as well. But for the sake of today's training, I wanted to just share information that oftentimes is misinterpreted, or there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding autism and surrounding ABA. So I thought that today's presentation would be a great opportunity to kind of clear some of those things up and share some of my experience with you guys. And hopefully I can also learn from your experience as parents, or as if we have any other professionals working in the field here, then we can learn from each other as well. So I've been a board certified behavior analyst now for 4 years, and mainly, oops, I'm not the most tech savvy, so you guys gotta work with me here. So the main population that I work with is children diagnosed with autism, right? And in my time working as a behavior analyst, I've been able to work with many families and many children, and what I've learned really quickly is that every family and every child is unique in their own way, right? So before I really dive into it, I think it's worth mentioning the disclaimer, right? And that all the information that is going to be shared here today is not medical advice, or is not meant to substitute treatment. It's not also meant to diagnose either. So, if you're seeking behavior analytic services for your child, for yourself, or for a loved one, it's important that you seek professional advice from a certified clinician so you can get individualized treatment. Today, it's going to be just information based on my experience and the things that have worked for me, and I hope to also hear from parents and from what has worked for you. There are going to be videos at the end of the presentation, and these videos are going to be from kiddos that I work with personally, and signed consent has been obtained for the sake of today's training, right? So the parents are aware that I'm using this information. Either way, in the training, you won't see any personal information, or you won't be able to identify the children. What is behavior analysis? If you look at behavior analysis online, you'll find many different definitions. But for the most part, it's the scientific study of behavior. Why do we behave the way we behave? As organisms, why do we do what we do? And as behavior analysts, with this information, what we look to do is to try to analyze contributing factors and trying to create a treatment plan that's going to improve quality of life, right? So trying to get to the bottom of why behavior occurs, right? So that we can manipulate those factors and trying to create more preferred outcomes, right? If that makes sense. So my personal definition of behavior analysis is just the science of learning and unlearning, right? I like to define it in that way, just because it allows you to apply that science in many different areas outside of autism, right? For the most part, behavior analysis has been associated with autism and autism therapy, and although it is very beneficial, the science of learning and unlearning could be applied in everything that we do, because behavior isn't everything that we do. And behavior is how we move, and behavior is everything that we do. So we can apply this science to ourselves, self-management strategies, or anything where we're looking to generate change for ourselves. we can apply the science of behavior analysis. So when it comes to, this presentation, I want to go over the foundational principles of behavior analysis. But the one thing that in my experience I've noticed is so many presentations are, they look the same, and it's just very much, you go online, you can find the same type of information. What is ABA about? You have the antecedents, you have the functions, and everything just seems very technological. Everything seems very just the same, and it doesn't look very applicable or relatable to people, right? So for the sake of my presentation, I'm going to go through the definitions that you can also find yourself, but I want to break them down and unpack them a little bit, just to make things a little bit more relatable, right? And I think that's kind of like the missing factor sometimes when it comes to these type of trainings. So with ABA, behavior analysis, one of the biggest principles of behavior analysis is ABCs, the ABCs of behavior, which are the antecedent stimulus, which is something that occurs before the behavior. Anything that occurs before the behavior is considered an antecedent, right? It's going to be basically what can trigger the behavior, right? Or it's an antecedent. It's a stimulus that creates an opportunity for behavior to occur, right? That would be the A portion of the ABCs, right? And the B would be obviously the behavior itself, the behavior that you're looking to modify, the problem behavior if you're working with a child that is on the autism spectrum. So this is the behavior itself, and the consequence is what happens immediately after the behavior, right? So typically, for the most part, what happens after the behavior is what determines whether the behavior continues or whether it's going to decrease in the future. And it's all based on whether the behavior was reinforced or whether it was punished after the behavior occurred, right? And in my next slide, I will dive a little bit into reinforcement and punishment, which are also concepts that you can also, probably find yourself. But again, for the sake of this training, I'll try to dive into it and make it a little bit more relatable, right? But for the most part, the ABCs of behavior, the antecedent, what happens before, the behavior itself, and the consequence are what we as behavior analysts want to look at before we even create a treatment plan, right? What is happening before the behavior that is occurring? What is the behavior itself? And what are we doing as parents, as practitioners, as therapists, for that child? What are we providing that child or that individual that we're working with that is making this behavior continue, right? So we're going to dive into that now. Is it all making sense? Is it all awesome? So for the 4 major functions of behavior, behavior has 4 major reasons why it occurs. And again, this is information that behavior analytic information, the science says we have 4 major functions. In my experience, I've noticed that is not that black and white, right? There's definitely wiggle room here, and there's many times where I've come across behaviors, not only with the children and the individuals that I've had a chance to work with, but even with myself, as I've applied behavior analysis to myself, that a lot of our behaviors, or a lot of behaviors, sometimes have multi-functions. Sometimes we do it for one reason, other times we do it for another reason, and we almost have to analyze every individual behavior as a whole new experience and try to break that down, rather than trying to create that behavior as an escape, as an attention, as a tangible, or as a sensory. It goes beyond this sometimes. So let's just get into the first one. And behavior eats is just an acronym for me to remember and for everyone to remember, the 4 major functions, right? So for the E in behavior eats is escape, right? So one of the reasons why behavior occurs is because we're looking to escape a given stimulus, right? And I'm going to use examples of children on the autism spectrum, and then every now and then I'll also throw in an example of individuals that are not on the autism spectrum, or perhaps adults ourselves, so that we can make things a little bit more relatable. But for escape, for example, I'll use an example of a child who is at school and doesn't like to do classwork, right? So if the behavior is, say, for example, he starts throwing items across the room, and the consequence is he gets removed from the classroom for misbehaving, then that behavior of him throwing is going to likely increase in the future because he was able to escape what he didn't want to do, which was the work itself, right? So that's actually one concept in this education system, and just in overall as parenting as well, where we use timeout, where we use overgeneralized strategies that sometimes are not applicable to that individual case or that individual situation, right? So escape is basically us trying to avoid something that we don't want to do and engaging in a behavior to try to avoid it, right? So as behavior analysts, when we see that type of behavior that is maintained by escape, one of our biggest things is to not reinforce that by allowing the individual to I guess escape that stimulus, rather working through it, right? So attention is basically we do things for attention, right? We want to have a communicative partner engage with us, so we may do a certain behavior to get someone's attention, right? Let's say, for example, for a child who has deficits with expressive language, you can't communicate well, and he needs something, because he can't use his words to say, hey, mom, come help me, he may engage in some screaming, he may engage in some self-injury, depending on the child. He may engage in some behaviors that to someone's perspective or outside perspective may look like child is misbehaving, or there may be a lot going on there, but in reality is the child's way of requesting, hey, I need help, hey, come to me, I need something from you, or I'm hungry, or I'm hot, I'm cold, whatever it may be, right? So some of the reasons why behavior occurs or maladaptive behavior occurs is because we're trying to obtain attention from someone or something, right? Access to tangibles. We do behavior because we want to get access to something, right? We work because we're going to get monetary compensation for it. Children sometimes may tantrum because they want to get their iPad back. And I say that as my son is in the back watching iPad. And I love to bring the iPad examples into my presentation, because iPads get a really bad rap, to be honest with you, and there's just a really bad reputation surrounding iPads and just social media and electronics in general. And I think everyone as parents, we're trying to avoid our children from being connected as much to them, but I feel like that's almost like swimming against the current in this day and age, right? So I think later on in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about the use of iPads and actually using them to your advantage and being resourceful in that sense. But access to a tangible, right? So you engage in a certain behavior because you want something back. You want, someone takes away your toy as a child, and you may tantrum because you want it back. You may throw yourself on the floor. That if a child engages in self-injury, he may attempt to hurt himself so he can obtain that item back. And sensory, which is one of the most intriguing ones, is sensory is basically as automatic reinforcement, right? So we do behavior because it feels good to us, right? It's not mediated by anyone else. So a child on the autism spectrum may, for example, let's say he may rock back and forth, right? And this could be a behavior that could be identified as self-soothing, right? And he is not looking to obtain attention from anyone. There is no demand being placed, so he's not looking to escape anything. And there's nothing tangible being offered or taken away, so he's not really looking to obtain anything back. He's just doing it because to him is self-soothing, is reinforcing to himself, and whether you walk into the room or not, or you step out and he's by himself there, he's likely going to be engaging in that behavior, whereas in the other ones, they're usually mediated by someone else, right? So, and this is one of the more tricky behaviors to try to modify, because in the field of behavior analysis, I feel like when we're very limited as to how to go about sensory integration and sensory related behaviors, and I'll dive a little bit into that and further down. So for today's training, I wanted to really cover the major developmental domains when it comes to child development, and then we'll kind of unpack it a little bit. So we have, cognitive ability, thinking processes, social skills, our ability to interact, adaptive skills, so like daily living skills, whether it's self-help skills, whether it's, we do food therapy as well as behavior therapists, or at least some of us do. So adaptive skills is just basically our ability to be independent in our self-help, our self-care. With motor skills, it's our ability to engage in precision movements like fine motor, like tying shoes, stringing, being able to tie a button. These are all things that play a role in self-care. And then gross motor are big movements like jumping, running, kicking, throwing, those type of movements. And language. So we have expressive and receptive language, and expressive is our ability to express what we want, whether it's through vocalization or whether it's through a sign, using sign language, whether it's through a PECS communication system or any functional communication system. And that's expressive language. And receptive language is how we interpret instruction and our ability to follow instruction and understand it and comprehend it. So with behavior analysis, as behavioral therapists, a lot of times we're creating treatment plans that target these major domains, and we use the science of behavior analysis to try to teach skill acquisition and teach children these type of skills so that they can almost meet their developmental milestones for their age, right? And I'll definitely dive into the developmental milestones in a bit as well, because I have a very unpopular opinion about that, which I'll actually like to share with you guys. But first of all, like, so we understand really what the basis of behavior analysis is and how we can use behavior analysis to modify behavior. We have to understand what positive reinforcement and what negative reinforcement is. Are you guys, anyone familiar with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement? You guys would like to take a guess? No? All good. Positive reinforcement is basically just, presenting a stimulus, right? And then that stimulus that we present is likely to make that behavior occur in the future, right? So examples of that can be praise, likes on social media, right? We post something on social media and we get 200 likes, and then we're like, okay, this works. I'm going to do it again, most likely, right? Because something occurred that I enjoyed, and I'm likely to continue doing that, right? And there was a stimulus change. There were likes from other followers. So that made my behavior increase in the future. And then we have negative reinforcement, which is us doing something to relieve or get away from something and for us to obtain relief from it. So let's say, for example, we get hurt and we take pain medication and we alleviate pain. So removing that pain is reinforcing to us, right? The same as, like, for example, us being in the cold and we put on a sweater, so we eliminate the cold. And now the behavior of putting on a sweater is likely to increase in the future when it gets cold, right? Because we noticed, okay, we removed this coldness, I feel a lot better, right? So putting on a sweater was negatively reinforced. And I hate to use the word positive and negative because it just gets so confusing sometimes. Sometimes when I'm working with parents and doing parent coaching, this area of positive and negative reinforcement is where sometimes things can get a little bit difficult for parents. And for me, it's just the way I like to break it down is, we present something, and if it's something that is rewarding and reinforcing, it's likely to continue occurring. If what we presented was something that was not rewarding, that behavior is likely to not continue because it was likely punished. And that's where punishment comes in, which also has a positive and negative, aspect to it, right? So let's dive into that a little bit. With positive punishment is, I'm going to read off this definition and then we'll break it down a little bit, right? So the frequency of a behavior decreases because in the past, responses have been followed by the presentation of an aversive stimulus. It's a lot going on there. It's a lot going on in that definition. But pretty much an example of positive punishment would be, let's say, for example, for the old school parents, spanking, right? So like, your child behaves bad, and not so old school. My parents spanked me a lot. So, but positive punishment is we're applying something, right? And what we apply is negative is for the child that's receiving what we're applying is punishment. So his behavior is likely to decrease in the future, right? So if the behavior decreases in the future, whatever we applied was punishing, right? And the tricky thing about this is that is worth mentioning is, sometimes punishment procedures like a timeout, and I'll talk about response cost and overcorrection in a bit, but something like punishment, like spanking a child. It's been known that, or at least everyone feels like spanking could have a punishing effect to a child. However, if we're not mindful of the ABCs of the behavior and the reasons why they're occurring, like the functions that we talked about, spanking can actually be rewarding to the child depending on the reason why the child was doing it. Let's say, for example, we have a child who has the difficulty with expressive language and communicating, and what he wants is attention from his mom, because his mom, let's say, for example, is all day on the phone, and she's texting away and doesn't pay attention to the child. And then he starts engaging in maladaptive behaviors. He starts throwing, screaming, and trying to get her attention, right? Is maintained by attention. So mom puts down her phone, comes over to the child. Why are you doing this and that? You're making too much noise, you don't listen, and then spanks, right? Although the hitting could be considered aversive to the child has mom's attention for a certain amount of time, and it's better than what he's received in the past 2 or 3 hours, right? So a lot of times what you see is parents are like, okay, I spanked my child, and I'm doing the right thing, but the behavior's not changing, right? At the moment it does, but then, an hour later, 2 hours later, or the next day or a week later, child's still doing the same thing. And yo le pego duro, I hit him, and he doesn't change, and it's because you're rewarding, right? It's rewarding the behavior, and we haven't really kind of broken down why the behavior is happening, right? So that's one example of positive punishment. And negative punishment is the removal of something that ends up being punishing to the individual or to the child, right? And I like to use examples of children in the school system, right? So timeout is actually something that, again, when I was coming up, I never got timeout. I used to get spanked, but in schools they use timeout sometimes, and this is just, a child is misbehaving. Okay, so we're gonna pull them out of the classroom or set them in the corner, and we assume that the child is being punished. And this goes back to the example that I gave with escape. If we're not aware of the reason why the behavior is taking place, the 4 major functions, right? Attention, tangible, which is access to something, escape, or self-stimulatory. If we're not aware of that, then putting a child, in a corner or removing him from a setting could actually be rewarding as well. For example, for that same example that I provided with the child throwing a tantrum because he was presented with classwork, if you provide a negative punishment, which would be timeout, you're removing the classwork, which is why he tantrumed in the first place, or why he engaged in that behavior in the first place. So then this is like a classic case. I've had maybe like 1 or 2 cases with children, and these are like teenagers in the school system who get suspended all the time, and they get referrals all the time, and they get sent home all the time for behaving poorly in school. And they've been suspended 4, 5, 6 times in the school year. And it's like, okay, by the 3rd time, you should know me sending him home is actually what he's looking for, right? So it's like he's looking to escape school because school is the aversiveness to it, right? So how can we move different in terms of us as educators and therapists? If we identify that the reason why this is happening is for escape, then we can maybe maneuver that behavior in a different way and do the opposite, right? So it's like if we're looking to escape school, if we're looking to escape classwork, rather than pulling the child away, why not? It's fine if we pull them away, but pull them away with the classwork, right? If we have someone that is engaging in a behavior and he is looking to escape school, as he wants to get sent home because every time he gets suspended, it's vacation time at home, he gets to play video games, right? So instead of doing that, why not do like an indoor suspension where you're still in school, but now you're isolated and you have double the classwork, right? That child or that individual is not as motivated to continue doing that because they can't go home, right? So these are simple things where behavior analysis could come in, and it's a very different way of thinking, right? You have to almost kind of train it's almost like you have to train yourself to think in a different way, because instinctively we do these things as parents, as teachers. We do these things, and with ABA, and behavior analysis, it almost like we have to really dissect every behavior and really see that what's the maintaining variable behind it. Right. So let's dive right into some of the behavior change procedures. With behavior change procedures, these are basically just strategies that commonly used, and they're all related to, the basis of it is reinforcement and punishment, right? So what makes these work is how we manipulate the reinforcer and the punisher, right? So with visual schedules, children on the autism spectrum sometimes have difficulty with transitions and with knowing, like if you have a child that has difficulty with receptive language, which we talked about is their ability to follow instruction and understand instruction, then a child on the autism spectrum disorder may have a difficult time understanding that, hey, when we go to school, you're going to be here for 5-6 hours, but then you're going to get a chance to go back home. Because they have a difficult time, or they may have a difficult time understanding that instruction, when they pull into the school, they may feel like they're going to be there forever, right? So they're going to try to escape, right? Going back to what we talked about with the functions, and that's where behaviors are going to come across, right? With visual schedules is basically you providing visuals of, okay, we're at school now, right? And this is you, we're at school now, we have lunch, we have academics, we have, recess, but you eventually get to go home, right? And as he goes down the schedule, it would create understanding for him, right, or for that individual, which is likely to decrease maladaptive behaviors or behaviors that are considered non-preferred, right? With token systems, it's the same idea. I'm a big fan of token systems, and it's just basically using a system where, and this is commonly used in schools too, where we use like stickers and stars and happy faces, and if a child earns 10 happy faces, then you get, get a reward, or you get a no homework pass or whatever it may be, right? So this is commonly used, and in ABA, sometimes token systems also gets a bad rap because it's like they say that it's overused and it's not as effective. And in my experience, I've noticed that it's not that it's not effective, it's not implemented right? So it's not just as simple as you rewarding the child and giving them a token and setting a criteria for it. It's not that simple. But to really dive into token systems, we would have to have a whole new training for it. We would have to have a whole new day just for that. But token systems is a visual that can motivate the child to continue to behave appropriately when out in society, if you're working with a child on the autism spectrum, right? And we find moments where he's behaving appropriately, and we can reinforce that child with either a sticker or a happy face or whatever we're using as a token system. And after we've created a criteria, okay, you earn 5, and after you earn 5, you get access to your iPad, or you get access to your very preferred snack. And I know the iPad situation, I'll get back to the iPad. I know a lot of you guys are not huge or may not be huge fans of iPads, but I heard no. But it's just how we use it, right? It's how we use it. It's almost like social media. It could be good or bad depending on how you decide to spend your energy and your time with it. But going back to what I was mentioning with token systems, it's a visual that helps the child, and it's going to create motivation. Pre-MAC principle is something that I often use with children that have good receptive language. So pre-MAC principle is basically a first and then. Okay, first we have to do this, then you get access to that, right? And this works well with children that are high functioning on the autism spectrum. And it creates an opportunity for the child to understand, okay, like there's a sequence to this. I have to do this first, and then I'm going to get access to the stuff that I want as well. So it's like a give and take. So that's something that I use, and it's pretty commonly used as well. And for children that have difficulty with receptive language, you can use a pre-MAC principle as well of first and then through a visual, right? So we can have, say, for example, I've used it before. I'll create a laminated sheet where I have like a green side and a red side, and I may have the picture of a child on the, let's say on the red side, and it's not time for him to have access to whatever it is that he wants, and I can deliver the pre-MAC principle. Okay, first we complete this, then you get to go play, right? And then when he earns the access to it, then I can switch over the visual, and then he knows, okay, I got access to that now, and the words now first then mean something to him now, right? So with differential reinforcement, is basically what we do as behavior analysts is trying to identify what the problem behavior is. Okay, we already identified what happened before, what the behavior is, what's the consequence, and we went through our 4 functions, right? We identified what's happening, so now it's time for me to redirect that behavior and teach a more appropriate behavior, right? So if the child, I'm gonna go back to the child who is hitting himself to get attention from mom, for example. If mom puts down her phone, hits, the behavior continues happening, that mom reaches out to a behavior analyst. The behavior analyst says, okay, let's go do a functional analysis and see what's going on, right? And we come to that conclusion that he's doing that for attention. As a therapist, I may step in, and every time he starts engaging in the maladaptive behavior and the hitting or the screaming, I may use that as an opportunity to teach him there's a more functional way to request that attention. You can come in and use functional communication skills if you have them, right? And say, hey, mom, spend time with me. Hey, mom, I want your attention, right? Whether that mom's going to do it or not is a whole different story. But in terms of the child's behavior, right, that's how we would want to target it, right? And to try to get the mom to give him that attention, it would be my job in parent coaching, right? And telling mom, like, okay, you seek my service, but now it's your turn to kind of do your part as well, because this is the reason why he's doing it, right? So differential reinforcement is basically teaching a replacement behavior, finding identifying the one that is maladaptive and finding a replacement behavior that is more appropriate, right? A child is, again, like I mentioned, hitting because he wants something. You teach functional communication skill. If the child doesn't have expressive language, has difficulty expressing himself, then we may have to implement a functional communication system, whether it be sign language, whether it be a PEC system, right, a picture exchange communication system. If he does have vocalization and words, then using those words to teach him, hey, you need to use your words to request, right? So that would be one example of using differential reinforcement to kind of shape and redirect the behavior. And that leads me into shaping, right? And shaping, is basically using what we identify to be the more appropriate behavior now and trying to teach that child, okay, now you're going to use your words to request, and it may require you to say 2 or 3 words for a child that is expressive in that sense, or for a child who's not, then it's going to require you it's going to require motor skills. It's going to be you grabbing the PEC picture, you presenting it to mom, or it's going to require you to actually engage in sign language, which is also requires motor skills and fine motor skills. And shaping is us stepping in, finding that opportunity to teach that child, okay, now what you do instead of hitting yourself is actually you put your hands in this way and you sign for more, or you tap yourself and you say, I want, right? And you point to mom as a gestural cue for mom to understand, hey, I'm supposed to go and try to give you attention now. So shaping is how we're going to shape that appropriate alternative behavior that we've identified, right? Extinction is one of those things in behavior analysis where if we identify a problem behavior and we know it's happening for a specific reason, we may want to remove that tangible or that stimulus that's creating that problem behavior, and we want to remove it before the iPad, right? So that's a good example. So if the iPad is problematic, right? Instead of removing it when he's engaging in poor behavior, you remove it non-contingently. So you remove it when he's asleep, right? So that when he wakes up, it's not available. There's just no access to it, right? And that typically leads to an extinction burst, right? Whereas if he was tantruming to get his iPad and you decided, I want to remove it now because I don't want to deal with the tantrums, well, the tantrums are going to get worse, right? Yeah. So typically, and this is not just with children, but with adults, with anyone that's looking and seeking behavioral change, things typically have to get a little bit more difficult before they start getting better, right? And I'll give you an example of, let's say, a non-autism example of basically an extinction burst. And it's, my wife is back here, but she's not hearing me. So my wife, right? So let's she does certain things to try to get my attention, and I sometimes buy into it depending on what my day is like. I have a heavy day at work, and she's upset about something, right? And she's not telling me exactly what it is. Some days I have patience for it. Some other days I may come in and like, why are you so quiet? And she's doing it for attention because she wants me to come in and engage with her, right? So if I analyze that behavior per se, and then I come in and I see her engaging in the behavior that she normally does to try to get my attention, and this time I decide to not approach her and ask her what's going on, knowing that she is upset. Instead, I don't provide that attention and I continue about my day. Her behavior initially is going to get worse, right? Because she's like, oh, you're not giving me attention now? Like, so now it's going to be even more problematic, right? But typically, and I'm going to go back to children on the autism spectrum, right? Typically with children on the autism spectrum, when we do the extinction burst, we deliver extinction, and we do experience that extinction burst, after the child learns like this is just the way it's going to be now moving forward, it creates a positive change in the behavior, right? Because you learn, oh, okay, no matter what now, this is just the way things are going to go. I'm not going to get that attention anymore. I have to now resort to a different way of obtaining that attention, right? And it may be through a more functional way. Will that work with my wife? Probably not, but that would be the idea as well, right? That would be the idea of, well, for us to communicate, right? So it's to communicate in a more functional way. Man training and tact training, these are all man, tact, and echoic training, which you'll see in a video that I have later on, are just us looking to teach skill for children on the autism spectrum. Man is just an ability for them to communicate. Tacting is just them being able to identify what's in front of them. What's this? And then maybe being able to either tell us verbally what it is or show us what it is. All right, so let me move right into this next slide, which I feel is going to be a little bit more applicable to everyone, because it talks more about the contributing factors surrounding autism spectrum disorder that perhaps are not talked about enough, right? So diet and what we eat, right? We are kind of what we eat sometimes, and this is not just with autism spectrum, but just in general, right? So if we have behaviors that are problematic to us or others, sometimes what we eat sometimes could be productive or counterproductive to our behavior, right? So with diets with children on the autism spectrum, it's important that we take these things into consideration, whether it's high sugar intake, whether it's sodium, and whether it's processed foods, whatever it may be. I think these are all things that is worth talking to nutritionists about, and they just can't be ignored, because when it's time to implement strategies as a behavior analyst, if we don't have these things accounted for, then it could be counterproductive, right? So if I have a child that I'm working with and he engages in a lot of self-stimulatory behavior, at least I identified that it was self-stimulatory behavior, and it looks like a lot of hand flapping, for example. But at the same time, he's having 5-6 different juices in the morning, and he's having candy all afternoon, and it's not contributing to the behavior, right? And if these things are not accounted for, my treatment implementation is likely not going to be as effective, right? So diet plays definitely a big role. Biological factors, comorbid conditions, ADHD, for example, right? And I'll give you the same example with a child who we're looking to have the child be more engaged, or the individual more engaged, pay attention more, be able to sit in a chair for longer periods of time. But at the same time, if we have an ADHD condition that is going undiagnosed, it's going to be very difficult for that child to be able to do the skill that I want him to do, which is to be attentive, to be engaged, and to be able to follow the criteria that I set, for example, of him being able to sit for 30 minutes before he gets access to his preferred activity, right? So these are all things that need to be accounted for. And how do we account for them as behavior analysts? We have to coordinate care with the professionals that are involved in that diagnosis, which are clinical psychologists, for example. And as parents, if we know our child, or we suspect our child may have more than one condition, we have to also take that initiative to go in and really dive and unpack it, to make sure that if we do seek behavior analytics services, we're getting the best type of service that we're getting, right? Medication. A lot of my kiddos, that I've worked with, some of them are on medication, and medications have good effects, and they also have side effects, right? And some side effects can include aggression, they could include self-injury behavior, they can include poor sleeping patterns, which all contribute to more increased behavior, right? So we may have children that have medication to help with ADHD, for example, which helps the sensory behaviors, for example, the hand flapping and the pacing and the running, that could be disruptive in school. But we have that behavior decrease, and now we have a different behavior in like self-injury, for example, or screaming or loud vocalizations because of perhaps a headache they may have and they can't express it, or any other side effect that if you have a child with difficulty with expressive language, he may reflect that uncomfort feeling through behaviors, right? So you may see the side effects of a child who has poor or difficult, he has a difficult time with expressive language. You may see those side effects as behaviors, right? So medications are things that you have to take into account and consider as a behavior analyst when you're looking to work with children, and you have to work closely with their neurologists and their doctors so that you can really unpack and see if there's other alternatives, other options, and maybe different type of medications, and they'll provide those same side effects. Sensory processing systems is probably my favorite part of the presentation, because as an ABA therapist, this is something that a lot of times we just don't have enough information on it, right? So if I have a child, I come in and he's engaging in a lot of self-stimulatory behavior, and we talked about early on in the presentation that this may look like, let's say, to give another example, it could be a lot of finger biting, right? So, but the child finger bites to the point where it looks really like he's bleeding, right? And it could be very uncomfortable for him, but he's doing it because to him it feels good, right? As a behavior analyst, sometimes when we come in, if we're not aware of sensory processing systems, we come in and we look at that behavior for it as a self-stimulatory behavior. And how do we address that stimulatory behavior? Sometimes, what I've noticed in my experience is that as analysts, as therapists, we come in and we provide an alternative, like we talked about with the differential reinforcement, right? Oh, we identified the behavior. Now let's identify an appropriate alternative and teach the child through shaping how to use this alternative behavior. Rather than biting himself, we can have him squeeze a stress ball, right? This would be an option, right? This would be a differential reinforcement. This would be an appropriate alternative for that child. However, sensory processing systems work in a very unique way, and this is something that's more related to occupational therapy, and this is why in ABA is not talked about enough, because targeting this can sometimes be considered us practicing a little bit outside of our scope, right? So I feel like there's a fine line between you practicing outside of your scope and you neglecting information that can help the child that you're working with, right? And in turn, providing a treatment that is not going to be effective, and ultimately that becomes unethical, right? Because as ABA therapists, we're supposed to treat our kiddos and our clients and try to promote the best outcomes and whatever's in their best interest, right? So the stress ball example, I provide the child with the stress ball, the individual with the stress ball, for him to stop biting his hands. However, in terms of sensory processing, a manipulative, right, like a stress ball, may create more alertness in the child or the individual, right? And the reason why the finger biting may be taking place is because there's high arousal, there's high level of alertness, right? When instead what we need to do is possibly bring that level of alertness down and almost like self-regulate, right? So rather than provide something that is going to alert more, we need to provide a different type of stimulation that is going to kind of bring that person down in terms of sensory-wise, and that's going to itself eliminate a little bit of the finger biting, because he doesn't have that energy in him to want to do that, or they don't have, sensory-wise, they don't have that desire to do that, right? So I'll give another example when it comes to sensory processing systems. I have a child that I currently work with him, and when I started with him, he would do a lot of running back. If he had a lot of open area, he would run back and forth. And initially when I started, I thought that it was elopement. Elopement is just basically, we were working with the child, and if there's an open area and he just takes off, which could be a very hazardous behavior, obviously, if you're out, on the street and you can take off, which has happened before. And I started targeting the behavior. I did, the whole ABCs of behavior, identified the function, and I assumed the function was to escape, right? To escape. And then I was going about it that way. And then I noticed that my treatment plan wasn't going anywhere. He kept running off during therapy, whether we were in a confined space, whether we were in a big space. So I took a step back and I said, let me observe this behavior a little bit more and see what's really going on, right? So I noticed that when I'm not there and I'm not present, he would still pace, run back and forth. It's not mediated by anyone. But it was one of those behaviors that, like I mentioned before, it was multifunction. Sometimes it was happening for one reason, other times it was happening for the other. But it just so happened that with that behavior, there was a sensory component to it. He would love to run because he would like the feel he gets from the running, right? So before I was informed about sensory processing systems, the way I would go about that, I said, okay, he does this because it feels good to him. Let me find an alternative that is more appropriate, right? Let's teach him a more appropriate alternative. And for me, it was, rather than running back and forth, let's take breaks on your trampoline. I'll schedule a break every 30 minutes. We get to jump on the trampoline for 10 minutes, right? He gets to run in the trampoline in a confined space. We get to jump as well, which he enjoys. And then afterwards, we can get right back to work. And it's likely now that he may not want to do it as much because he already kind of exerted some of that energy. And he knows that he has another break coming up where we get to do that again. Thought it was going to be working perfect. For me, it felt like an amazing plan. It worked for about a day. And the next day, right after the trampoline, take off again. And I was like, we just jumped. Like, I thought you would be good already. We take off, and I was like, okay, so what's going on? So I decided, I'm going to start working closely with an OT, right, to see what's really going on here. So I noticed that I learned that there are different types of sensory stimulation that we can provide, and they have different purposes, right? So for a child like the kiddo that I work with, if he's taking off, he's running, and his level of alertness is just high. So the type of stimulation that I have to provide him has to be one that is a calming effect, right? That kind of brings him down and regulates his processing system a little bit. And there are specific exercises for that, right? So rather than jumping is alerting, right? So it creates let's say like a battery, right? So rather than bringing the energy down, it's kind of giving him more. So once we leave the trampoline, he just has extra energy and he has to go exert it, right? So with the sensory processing system, after working closely with an OT, I realized, okay, I can do other type of sensory integration that is going to kind of fit my purpose a little bit better, right? So rather than jumping with him, for example, what I do now is, and you'll see it on one of the videos, we put him on a stress ball and I rock him back and forth, right? So this type of motion has a calming effect in children that have a different type of processing system. We all have processing systems, and we all process stimulus in a certain way. Children on the autism spectrum process stimulus in a different way than perhaps I do, than perhaps you do, right? For me, this AC condition, like this air conditioning vent right now, sounds the way it sounds to you perhaps, but if I have a child here on the autism spectrum, this may sound very, very loud, right? And he may need a type of sensory input that is regulating and calming, right? So if he's here sitting and he's covering his ears because it's way too loud, and I sit here with him and I provide him, hey, Johnny, look, it looks like you're stressed out. Here's a Play-Doh or a stress ball. That is the tactile sensory input is alerting, right? So he'll start doing this and it'll just get way too louder, and he'll start doing this even more because that type of input is going to heighten everything else, right? So instead, I may want to do some squeezes. I may want to do some deep pressure. I may want to do some joint compressions, right? These are all things that as behavior analysts we don't really dive into as much. However, that being said, if we have, by the way, is there any behavior analysts or behavior therapists here today? No? Good. No, but when I talk about some of these things, because I teach some of these things to some of my supervisees when I'm working with them, and sometimes I'm working, let's say, in a therapy center, and I have other analysts observing me, right? And they're like, "Is he doing like OT work? Like, what's he doing there? Is he practicing outside of his scope? Is that unethical?" Like, there's a lot of question marks there. But kind of my counter argument and what I want to bring awareness to more is that if we don't have that information, a typical analyst would come in and provide that stress ball. A typical analyst would come in and provide that Play-Doh. A typical analyst would come in and do that jumping on the trampoline, right? And it's going to be counterproductive to what we're trying to do, right? So in reality, if we're not accounting for that, what are you really doing as an analyst, right? Or what are you telling the parents when the behavior is not improving? Are you contributing this now to other factors, right? Because you have to cover yourself as a therapist, right? So you have to cover yourself as a therapist, and you're like, okay, no, but my implementation, I'm following things to the T. Things are not working. There must be something else going on, right? And that's typically kind of the way we go about it. But there's definitely more things to it, and that's why I feel the best approach is a multidisciplinary approach, where you're aware of what you do in your science, but you don't neglect what other sciences are doing and the role they play in children on the autism spectrum, right? like speech and OT. And this leads me to multidisciplinary approach. Again, and I mentioned about there being a fine line within, practicing within your scope and kind of neglecting information that is important. And another example of that would be, with speech and oral motor. We have children that have difficulty with expressive language and can't communicate and articulate words to communicate. And we, as behavior analysts, really don't dive into oral motor because that's not what we do. That's speech, right? But that being said, as behavior analysts, we do man training, which you saw in the previous slide. And man training is basically trying to teach the child how to communicate, right? And echoic training, which is basically early learners, the first sounds like ooh, the ahs, the bahs, right? We're basically stepping into speech territory, right? And we're doing that consistently. We have an early learner, and I'm coming in and I'm doing a functional analysis. I'm following the ABCs, and I'm doing the 4 functions, right? And I notice that his attention, I need to teach this child functional communication skills. Let's start with echoics and sounds. I have to be aware, at least I feel, I have to be aware of the science behind teaching that, right? Because I have to be able to know how to do it in the most efficient and effective way. And if I don't, then I'm doing that child a disservice and that family a disservice. So coordinating care with speech and understanding what oral motor is about. And if you're not going to, obviously, if you're not going to implement it because you're a BCBA, at least having a speech person on the team, right, who's actually doing it, who's teaching you how to go about that type of therapy. And if you don't feel comfortable with doing it yourself, that's fine, but making sure that that's accounted for, right, as part of therapy. So these are just a multidisciplinary approach. That's what it's about. Being able to, if you're going to teach gross motor skills as a BCBA, get familiar with what physical therapy is doing, because they're the ones in charge of movement. How are they moving the child? OT, how are they presenting sensory? Speech, how are they teaching communication skills and oral motor, right? So that I can have my programs be more efficient. And again, in ABA, a multidisciplinary approach sometimes is looked at like you're kind of stepping out of your lane, like stay in your lane type of deal, right? But it's one of those things where if we kind of stay in our lane and we go about how we've been taught to do, then I feel like it's just very limiting, because with children on the autism spectrum, there's so many contributing factors, so many things going on that contribute to the behavior. And in ABA, we can't account for all of them, right? So a multidisciplinary approach for me is what I feel works best, and is what I always suggest and recommend, not only to parents, but to therapists and anyone working with children on the autism spectrum, right? Coordinate care, work with other professionals in the field of special needs, and really prepare yourself to the highest level as a therapist so that you can provide the best desired outcomes. And so learning through associations, and I promise, how many slides do I have? I may have a couple. Oh, we're getting close to the videos. Learning through associations. This is basically behaviors, like I mentioned, behavior is a product of the circumstances, and particularly the events that immediately follow it, right? We touch a stove and we burn ourselves, we're probably not likely to touch it again, right? The behavior was punishing, and it quickly taught us it was hot. I don't want to feel that again, so I'm likely not going to do it again, right? So if we are able to understand what happens after the behavior, we can start modifying and presenting a different outcome or a different consequence, so we can shape behavior, right? I mentioned antecedent associations, and I wanted to mention trauma. And with antecedent associations, it's basically, and going back to the example of touching the stove and burning yourself, for example. If I touched the stove and I burned myself, and it was a Wednesday afternoon, and it just so happened that the sibling was running up and down the house, it may be that the next time the sibling is running up and down the house and it's a Wednesday and the stove is on, that itself may elicit some type of feel in me or in the child or whoever the subject is, right? So it's important, and I think in ABA that's not sometimes taken into account enough, is the role that trauma plays in ABA and in children on the autism spectrum. Sometimes we have children that have received ABA, previous ABA, and it's been poor quality ABA. And ABA, for the most part, like I mentioned, has been associated with autism spectrum disorder. And sometimes there are cases where there is unethical type of practices taking place, punishment procedures are being implemented when they shouldn't be. And all these things can create trauma, especially to a child who has difficulty expressing himself, difficulty with receptive language, right? So then it just so happens that we change practitioners now, and now I have a child who is coming from receiving poor services, unethical type of practices, and I have to take these things into account. And now I have to almost shape and create a new association, create a new learning history, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about, and this is why I like to define behavior analysis as the science of learning and unlearning, right? Because the same way how we can teach a new skill, through the same principles that we've covered today, we can unlearn bad habits and poor associations that we've made along the way. And this is the reason why behavior analysis, for me, I'm so big on it. Not so much, it plays a huge role in autism spectrum disorder, but like I mentioned, there are so many factors with autism spectrum disorder that ABA itself can be the sole factor to improve that condition. But ABA can be so applicable to mental health and for our day-to-day, for us, looking to increase a better behavior or unlearn a poor pattern that we have, right? So I'll dive a little bit into that, in the mental health portion of it. But basically the trauma in children with autism spectrum disorder has to be taken into account, especially if they're coming from other therapies that are not as effective or as, I guess, ethical, you can say. And this is an example that I had here where a child cries at the site of a therapy center where they implement punishment procedures, right? I have an extra bullet there, shouldn't be there. But this is a perfect example, right? So this is actually an example that has happened to me. I do some work with the therapy center, and I had one kiddo who every time he used to pull into the parking lot with his mom, just the sight of the parking lot itself was aversive already, right? So there was antecedent associations there, right? So it's like antecedent is what happens before the behavior. The behavior is him crying and tantruming in the car, and what was happening before is mom driving into the driveway where he associates the driveway with the type of therapy that he normally receives from that place, which is not good, right? So for me, in that particular case, I had to take it out all the way to the outside to the parking lot, right? And create a different association, a different learning history, create a new neural pathway, right? It's almost like rewiring and retraining, right? Brain retraining almost, you can say it, right? So this goes to my last bullet where it says neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to adapt to the circumstances you present it, and it basically rewire itself. Our experiences create new neural pathways, right? So if, so if maybe I should go on this side. Yeah. No, maybe I should stand back here. But so basically, in the whole parking lot area, for me, the idea behind that is to associate the parking lot now with a different history, right? So I would take the most preferred activities and the most preferred tangibles that we had, and we would bring it out to the driveway. We would bring it out to the parking lot, so that every time he comes in, he doesn't associate this with, oh, this is the beginning of my nightmare when I normally come into the center, and then associating this center now with something that is preferred, right? Whether it's that preferred activity or the new reinforcing activity that we have inside the center. For the first couple of weeks, there were no demands placed in this therapy center. So he associated this therapy center with being, okay, I come in, we have an awesome therapist that comes outside and greets me outside, and we get to play outside for a little bit, and then we walk inside and I get access to all the coolest toys and trampolines and everything in the world. My mom comes and picks me up, and it's all good. This is nothing like how it used to be when I used to be in this other therapy center. We used to come in, and they used to make me do contingent exercise. They used to put me in timeout. We used to have reprimands, right? So now what I'm doing is I'm creating a new learning history, right? So the same way that we do that in that example, we could do that with ourselves through self-management strategies, right? So if we have poor habits, if we have bad habits, and we want to kind of break a cycle, same idea, right? We find what we're doing that is not giving us a preferred outcome, and we try to do something different, right? Move in a different direction and do something different about it and create a different learning history, right? So let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide has basically the videos that I wanted to share with you guys. But before I get into the videos, I want to touch on the mental health aspect of things a little bit first, and then we'll dive back into the videos at the end. I want to stay away from the speaker. But mental health in general, I think it's something that right now is starting to, there's a lot of awareness behind it now, which is a good thing, right? But just like anything else, we have to make sure that the information that we're getting on mental health is good information, right? Because especially with social media nowadays, everyone is a life coach, everyone is a therapist, everyone is a, right? So all the information that you see out there, whether it's for children on the autism spectrum, whether it's for parents of children on the autism spectrum, everything, there's so much information out there. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's evidence-based, sometimes it's not. It could be contradicting as well. So it's important that as parents of children on the autism spectrum, and even if we're not parents of children on the autism spectrum, just ourselves, it's important that we are mindful of how we spend our energy and what type of information we're consuming, right? So one of the biggest things with parents that have children on the autism spectrum are the developmental milestones, and I think that I touched on that a little bit earlier, that I wanted to kind of touch on this a little bit, because sometimes what happens is we get into, we're working with a child, and the child is 4 years old, and sometimes what we do is we may look into the milestones for a 4-year-old, a typically developing 4-year-old, and we start doing comparisons of, okay, a typically developing 4-year-old should be able to do this, that, and the other. He should be able to communicate in full sentences. He should be able to attend communicative partners. He should be able to follow instruction. And if we have a 4-year-old who is not meeting that, this could create stress for ourselves as parents, right? And one thing that should be mentioned is that in terms of development, especially with children on the autism spectrum, it's not so much about the chronological age, right? But it's more about the functioning ability and where we're at, right? From how we're functioning at that age, right? So it's not so much about chronological age, and sometimes when we get fixed on the chronological age, we may get fixed on the milestones or where the child should be, right? And we put added pressure not only on the child, but on ourselves and on therapists, and it just becomes a very stressful situation, which ultimately does not play well for our mental health as parents, right? So understanding that also progress for children on the autism spectrum is not always an upward trend, right? Because like I mentioned before, there are so many contributing factors, right? That on a given day, on a given week, on a given month, there may be medication changes, there may be comorbid situations that are not being taken care of, there may be diet changes, there may be so many things going on that are going to affect behavior and are going to affect the ability of that child to continue progressing in their milestones, right? So understanding that sometimes progress comes in peaks and valleys, and that's not just with children on the autism spectrum, but for us as well. Emotionally, sometimes we have great days, but they're not all great days, right? We have peaks and valleys, but what's important to know, and it's worth mentioning, is, once treatment is taking place, right, and we've identified a good practitioner, we've identified good therapy, the valleys that we have are not as steep as they used to be, right? And our trends, when we start progressing again, are steeper, and then we continue to make progress in that way. And we don't have to have a linear trend every single time as a parent looking for therapy for our children. If we see a minor step back, doesn't mean that we're going to now regress completely, right? It's just that maybe during that minor step back, we need to really kind of adjust, modify things so that we can continue promoting progress. So these are things to keep in mind as parents of children on the autism spectrum, because it's important to know that these changes may come and that we have to be well prepared for them, and it's going to help us mentally, right? And taking a break, not only from therapy, the children get overwhelmed as well when they have therapy from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, right? And that could be very overwhelming to have someone on you the entire time telling you, do this, do that, this is how you communicate, this is what you don't do, this is the new replacement behavior, you're supposed to do that, right? And at the end of the day, especially if you're working with children, they're kids, right? So they need a moment to do what they enjoy doing, right? And as a parent, you also have to give yourself a break, right? So be able to understand that the child has to be allowed to be a child as well, and that as a parent, it's going to be very difficult to play every role, every hat. The parent, play the hat of a parent, and then also play the therapist hat. It's very difficult to do at the same time, and that it's okay to take those breaks, right? And outside of the autism spectrum disorder, for us, and taking breaks and taking breaks from what we do day to day, I think is super important as far as self-care as well. And just being able to understand the things that make us feel well and doing more of that, right? And doing more of that and prioritizing that, scheduling that if you have to, and it just does well for your mental health, right? And I mentioned, being mindful of the stuff that you read on social media. There's a lot of overgeneralization taking place, especially with diagnosing, right? So you may come into content that says, if a child does this, that, and the other, he is high level autism spectrum, get him checked out, this, right? But all that information, a lot of it is subjective sometimes. And it's important that, that you take everything that you see with a grain of salt, right? A lot of times the stuff that is being posted online is being posted for other reasons, right? Not informational reasons, but like for whether it's attention, it could be attention, right? It could be attention. We would kind of have to really dive into that behavior and figure it out. But there, a lot of times, is not in the best interest of the consumer, right? So being mindful of a lot of overgeneralization and taking everything with a grain of salt that we see online. Joining empowerment groups, parent empowerment groups, and it's just being able to surround yourself with people who understand where you're coming from as a parent. If you're a parent with children on the autism spectrum, surround yourself with more parents that can share, your concerns and your doubts or whatever question marks you may have. Because if we're, associating ourselves more with parents who don't relate to that, then we may add pressure to ourselves when we're comparing perhaps our kids, or we're, hearing stories about so-and-so's development is different from my child's development, right? And that could become very conflicting. And outside of ABA therapy, outside of autism spectrum disorder, I feel like when we have problem behavior, whether it's an addiction, whether it's a poor habit, whether it's something that we're looking to change within ourselves, we should also associate with people and individuals that are going to contribute to our change, and not people that are going to create more obstacles, right, for ourselves, right? For in terms of our mental health, we have to be mindful of who, not only the content that we consume, but who we decide to share that energy with, right? People that are going to contribute to our growth. Before I ask you guys to follow me on Instagram, I'm going to go into some of the videos that I have here. And again, some of these videos all come from the methodology of ABA, right? So it's through the science of reinforcement, punishment, creating associations, unlearning, learning new behaviors while unlearning poor habits, and creating different neural pathways and new learning histories, right? And it's just basically with this whole, I have moved different here because my company of higher echelon behavior, it really hangs its hat on doing things differently, all right? And this is not just with child therapy. Again, my company and my vision and my focus is child therapy, is mental health or mental performance coaching, and sports and movement, right? So in everything that we decide to do is finding, for me, is moving different and understanding, okay, if I'm not getting the results that I want in this way, I need to do something different. I can't expect to achieve different results while doing the same thing that hasn't gotten me anywhere, right? So just something as simple as that gives us a place to start, right? To do something completely different. So in these examples, I show how I deliver reinforcement, I show how I deliver some shaping, and how I create, more than anything, I create learning opportunities. And I think as a therapist, working with children, we have to create learning opportunities, right? Sometimes learning opportunities don't present itself naturally, right? But we can contrive the environment, and we can contrive situations to create those situations where we can teach appropriate alternatives and create new learning histories. So let's start with, see this video. So in this video, I'm basically teaching body parts, right? And I think that teaching body parts is so essential for a child who has difficulty with expressive language, because not only, I always think as a parent, right? I have one parent of 3, and if my child wasn't able to communicate to me pain and what pain is like, or what he's feeling, then it would be a difficult behavior to address. If he's tantruming or if he's hurt, I wouldn't know what's going on. But if my child is able to identify where his head, where his shoulder is, where his knee is, and I associate pain, are you feeling pain? Where? And he's able to identify where it's happening, that could give me an indication of, okay, I can better help my son now, my child. So I think body parts is just such a big program, in my opinion, to teach body parts. It's one of those programs for me that is essential, along with functional communication skills. and I'll show you a quick video of how I kind of target this a little bit outside the box. Shadows, by the way, is for him, or this individual is highly reinforcing, right? So he's outside, and if the sun is hitting him at the right angle, he's, you know, dancing and he's looking at his shadow, and he can do that all day, right? So for me, as a therapist, it was like, okay, I need to identify what the reinforcer is. We talked about reinforcement and punishment. What can I use to motivate him so that I can teach him something that perhaps is not going to be as preferred, right? Because teaching body parts may be, for him, like, he may not find as useful, and it becomes one of those situations where it requires repetition, it requires consistency, and it could become something that could be overwhelming if there's no MO in place, right? If there's no high level reward or something that he enjoys. So first step for me was identifying what is it that he enjoys to do. Okay, incorporate my therapy into that. All right. So that was my attempt to try to get him to be more open to the idea of working on body parts, right? So now every time he sees me with the flashlight, he already walks to the wall and he's like ready to do his body parts, right? So my idea is that we can transition that now from here and take it more into a different setting where perhaps we could be in I don't know, in a therapy center, or we can be outside somewhere in more of a natural environment and teach him like, hey, you know, do this, you know, point to your head, right? And for him to be able to show what we worked on here in a different setting, right? And that would be ideal. So that's kind of like where I'm going with this program. And that's me reinforcing, you know, every time that he engages in the behavior that I want him to do, he's getting access to engaging with the shadows, and that's rewarding in itself, right? And I think that, like I mentioned, the plan is for us to be able to transition to where the behavior matters the most. This behavior coming up now, this video coming up now is going to touch a little bit on the sensory processing systems that we talked about when it comes to providing the right type of input, right? This is the kiddo that I was talking about where we were jumping on the trampoline and he would just take off on me every time and I couldn't figure it out. And then I noticed, you know, I started learning, okay, if we provide the right type of input, we can provide a calming effect, which is going to do better for him. Right now, currently, with him, we have, I provide maybe every 30 minutes, I provide maybe 5 or 10 minutes of sensory input. And then we continue because we're working on a lot of high effort things that require a lot of effort for him. So I provide breaks often. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier of providing the right type of input. In that video, I want to be able to provide him with different type of stimulus that would perhaps be reinforcing to him in the future, right? So I'm a big sports person, and anytime I can bring in sports into therapy, I love it. So I had a soccer ball there with him. Right now, he looks at it as a task, right? As just another task. But because I'm giving him exposure to it and he's being reinforced for engaging in that activity by being on the sled, which he loves to do, or jumping, which he loves to jump, then he is getting more exposure to it. And what ends up happening, or the idea or the goal would be for that soccer ball now to become a conditioned reinforcer. I've conditioned him now to be more open to engaging in this, and he's open to it because I'm also incorporating things that he enjoys. And typically with children on the autism spectrum, I think it's important to notice it's not that they don't enjoy playing with sports and they don't enjoy sports, or they don't enjoy playing with toys in an appropriate way. It's just that perhaps they haven't had enough exposure to it for an extended amount of time, right? So what happens is if I present Johnny with a soccer ball, he looks at it, it doesn't make any cool sound, doesn't make any cool noise, right? It doesn't look in a certain way, doesn't feel a certain way. He's over it. I'm on to something else, right? It's more fun for me to run back and forth and feel the wind, right? So if I incorporate the soccer ball into that running that he enjoys to do, right? Then after the ball bounces 2 or 3 times and we continue doing it for so long, first he's willing to do it because I'm incorporating the running that he enjoys. And we do that enough, he starts to perhaps be exposed to the reinforcing properties behind that sport or behind that ball, which are bouncing, kicking, throwing, right? So now that we're doing this and for him it's as a task, he may look at it now like, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, I'm down to do this because it's actually not too bad. Like, kicking it is actually kind of fun and it bounces kind of high, right? So it's kind of increasing the likelihood that he participates in this moving forward. So I like to pair the things that I know work and they enjoy with things that perhaps are neutral, but can perhaps become reinforcing, right? And that's the same way I go about teaching children how to use toys appropriately, right? I present it as a task first, and then allowing them to get enough exposure to it as to where they can come in contact with the reinforcing properties behind it, right? So let's go on to have maybe just a couple more videos here, maybe like 3 more videos. This video that I'm gonna post now. This is food therapy. So this is for children that has a difficult time with different textures and picky eaters, right? So in this video, and this is one where I use the iPad in the videos, and this is why I wanted to touch on the iPads, because when used appropriately, especially with a child, sometimes we have, like I mentioned, having that reinforcer and that one strong stimulus that we know the child enjoys is important to have. But sometimes with some of our kiddos, there's not that one thing that they naturally gravitate to. Sometimes we may have a kiddo who can just jump around from toy to toy, from activity to activity, and there's not one thing that he really, really enjoys, maybe except the iPad, probably, right? In some cases. But if we avoid using the iPad because we don't want them to be hooked on the iPad, right? And we don't want them to be then as a therapist or as a parent, I don't have an MO for that child. I don't have motivation for that child to engage in whatever it is that I want him to engage. Therefore, I can't create learning opportunities, right? And everything, in fact, everything now is going to be very aversive for the child, because now I'm kind of, it's almost borderline traumatic, right? I'm forcing the kid now to do stuff, and he's like, there's nothing here for me. There's nothing here that I enjoy. There's nothing, right? So in that sense, with the iPad, if I can only resort to that, I use it, but I'm very mindful that when I use the iPad, I want to use that same iPad to also condition other things like I talked about, the soccer ball, the toys, and use that same iPad to condition different novel activities that can perhaps have a reinforcing effect later on, and you'll see that on the next video. But this one, I use the iPad to try to get him to be more willing to bring food closer to his mouth, or just in the proximity of it, or even touching it, right? So that's something that we do called desensitization, and then we progressively expose the child to different textures and different things that perhaps are aversive to him. And this is a type of treatment that is also common in clinical psychology with phobias, for example, anything related to fear, right? So we have a fear of being in large crowds, for example. A progressive exposure treatment plan could be the individual first being okay with seeing pictures of large crowds and progressively kind of building on that, right? And then being able to see a movie of large crowds in a concert, and then talking about being able to dialogue and talk about large crowds and what it feels like, and what is it that's difficult, and perhaps driving by one, right? It's very progressively, right? So the same idea with systematic desensitization with food eating, and non-preferred foods is more about first being him, in this particular case, is him being able to be okay with it being in close proximity, then it being able to him just touch it, right? And I think at this point, we're at the point where he's able to put his tongue on it. So we had him touch, with his lips, and now his tongue, and I hope to continue building on that, where he can take a couple bites without having to swallow and build like that, right? So again, sometimes we don't want our kiddos to be hooked on the iPads and tablets and videos and YouTube, but in this particular case, we're trying to use it and be resourceful in using it in a productive way. And then after we're able to complete some of these tasks, then using that same video and same iPad to condition other things that are going to be reinforcing later on, like, for example, bike riding, which I'll show now. Bike riding was actually something that was very, very forced. Like it was a lot of effort on his part, right? Because he didn't have the gross motor skills for it. So when I presented the bike, this is something that we talked about with mom and with family. How can we create different activities and toys and tangible things that he can enjoy outside of just videos, right? So through the use of the video and pairing it with the bike and allowing and creating that motivation for him to participate with the bike, because it's effort, like it requires a lot of effort, but because the video's in place, he's open to it. We were able to condition the bike to become something that is now a preferred activity for him. So when I step into therapy, he'd almost rather use the bike than the iPad for the most part. But it was very, had to break it down to the smallest teachable units and just kind of build from there. And I'll show in the beginning, literally my hands are on his feet and we're having to do the basic motions. And every time he would pedal 3 times without going anywhere, I would reinforce with the video. And then we would build from there. The next session would be like if he can almost pedal and just go all the way around, then he would get access to his video. And I started changing the criteria in that way. And then, what he used to do before of like pedaling twice wouldn't give him access to the video anymore. Then he would look at me like, oh, I need to do more. Okay, so I need to pedal more. And I changed the criteria in that way so that he can learn, okay, like I need to just continue building, right? And then I'll get access to my video eventually. He started contracting with that reinforcing property that the bike had of actually riding it, and was like, oh, this is actually fun. I get to do what I do when I run, but instead I'm pedaling, I get to go a lot faster sometimes. And it became a very, very reinforcing activity. We're able to now condition a new preferred activity, and sensory-wise, it helps him regulate because it's a type of movement that is calming, right? So it just serves a dual purpose for him. He's big on rough play, so I use a lot of like physical play with him. I do hugs and we wrestle, and that's kind of what we work for, right? So he knows that if he's willing to engage with me sitting and working with pictures, he knows that after 4 or 5 trials, I may tickle, I may grab, and I can provide that type of tickle and that type of input because he's not one of those kiddos that we need to bring a calming effect to, but instead we actually need to bring him up a little bit because otherwise he will not be too willing to move and engage a lot, right? So he requires a different type of input, and that's why I could do the spinning with him, I could do the trampoline jumps with him, I could do the tickles with him because it helps him in his particular sensory system. When I do these type of trainings is an opportunity for me to learn as well from the audience and from everyone's experience as well. So I wanted to kind of ask you guys, thoughts, questions. Thank you guys.
Again, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the presentation. I know that you mentioned briefly about autism, and you mentioned of underlying illness or disease. As a parent, do you have any tips and clues of how can I identify by seeing if maybe perhaps my son have anything underlying that I haven't picked up yet, but based on your experience, you have a couple of cues in a sense?
That with that question is a little bit difficult, but because in that case I would be stepping outside a little bit of my scope, right? Because that's a little bit more of like clinical psychology and diagnosing. There are obviously big signs of certain conditions, right? But again, because there are so many contributing factors, then sometimes it's difficult to identify like, okay, perhaps his inability to be attentive it could be because of ADHD, but it could be something else, right? It could be maybe there's biologically something going on, he's not feeling well, maybe there's a mineral missing, right? Because of this, something that is not talked about enough, right? Getting their blood works, making sure that they have everything, there's no imbalances, right? There's no imbalances, things like that. So my suggestion would be just if you have quality therapy, quality ABA therapy, and your child is receiving speech OT, and you see that there are still things that he's having difficulty with, there are certain behaviors that are not accounted for, and things like that, I think it's important to also coordinate care with a licensed psychologist, right? Someone that, and it's tricky because sometimes, it has to be the right type of psychologist, right? Because sometimes it's so easy to, you walk into a psychology appointment and you're going to leave with a diagnosis, right? I can walk in right now and I'm going to leave with ADHD for sure, right? But, it's important for you to educate yourself on kind of what the signs are, right? And be able to, if you do, coordinate care with a licensed psychologist, getting more than one opinion, right? We're getting more than one opinion, but making sure that those other signs are accounted for, especially if you want ABA to be effective and for it to work, for sure. I hope that answers your question.
Hello, thank you for coming. I would like to ask, how can we implement this for children that are over the age group that you normally work with? Eventually these little ones grow up to be young adults and teenagers.
Yes.
Do you have any tips or advice to share with us on that age group?
I think I think the science doesn't change, right? Depending on the age, it doesn't change. It's just the way we implement it does, right? So I think for children, that's why early learning and early intervention is so important, because if we don't target some of these behaviors early on, then what could look like screaming at the age of 4 could look a lot more disruptive if it goes unaccounted for at the age of 14 and 15, right? So that's why early intervention is the most important. But in the case that we have teens that haven't received a lot of therapy, right? I think in that sense, one of the biggest things, that's where pairing plays a big part. And pairing is basically you establishing a relationship with that individual first, right? So making sure that you, as a therapist or as someone, as a professional working with that individual, that person associates you with fun and gratifying and reinforcement, right? So if I'm working with a teenager, because his behaviors, especially if he hasn't received quality therapy for most of his life, and he has a lot of behaviors, his behaviors may be of high magnitude, right? So I have to make sure that I really establish myself with reinforcement. I identify the things that he enjoys doing. What does he naturally gravitate to? What does he do when I'm not there? If no one places any demands on him, what does he gravitate to? What does he like? What are his tangibles, the things that he likes, and the breaks that he takes? What does he spend his time doing? And incorporate myself into that, right? So I think with them, and it's no different, like I mentioned, with our younger learners. We do the same type of stuff, but just with the older learners, it's more difficult to create learning opportunities, and we have to be more creative on how we create those opportunities, right? So it's very essential that I feel like with therapy, with adolescents, whether they're on the spectrum or not, the early stages of therapy determine how therapy is going to go, right? So the early interactions, the first early on interactions, right? It's almost like the first 2 or 3 sessions will determine if, this is going to be a dynamic that's going to work. And I feel like one of the biggest things too is in terms of compliance, right? Because you can pair and you can establish yourself with reinforcement all you want, but if that individual still exhibits like task refusal every time you present him with an activity or something to do, you yourself as a practitioner, as a therapist, you have to follow through, right? You have to establish yourself and create boundaries and set criterias, right? Where it's like, okay, I understand, we've developed a relationship and you like engaging with me, but you don't like to do the things that we need to do. We're going to do this first, and then you get access to the stuff that you want, right? And really kind of like, it's almost like not putting your foot down, but making sure that you establish those boundaries, right? So that they don't feel like that's negotiable, right? Because that could definitely be problematic in that relationship moving forward and the success of therapy. I hope that helps. Awesome.
What would be the main reason
Yep.
you would refer a child from a regular ABA classroom to outside the district? What would be
So when would I refer a child from an ABA setting to mainstream? Okay, so an ABA center, an ABA type of clinic, for example, is a very restrictive center, right? So that's, I would say, maybe the most restrictive setting for a child on the autism spectrum, right? And I think it goes from there to then a special needs program at a public school, for example, and then from there it can go into like mainstream, right, where they're being shadowed by a therapist, and then eventually they're independently in a classroom on their own. So I think those are the levels of, as far as like the most restrictive to the least restrictive type of settings. It kind of goes in that way. It goes like ABA setting, right, from an ABA centered type of clinic where we're doing one-to-one. And if we feel like there's progress being made there, and we're seeing the skills that are being taught here, they're being applied outside of the center, then we can move on to, let's say, for example, a special needs program where the child is around other peers, right? And we can apply some of the stuff that we learned in the controlled setting, right? And if we see progress here, then we can now step it up a notch and go into a mainstream classroom with a shadow, with a therapist that can be there to guide and prompt if needed, right? So I'm hoping that I'm grasping your question, right? Yeah? Okay, so that we would kind of go about it in that way. And then the goal is always to try to get the child to be part of his peers and his age group. And right, it's into mainstream, right? So that's always going to be the goal, but it has to be in that way, right? Otherwise, if we move too soon, then it could be counterproductive to what we're trying to do, for sure.
of intervention in the classroom, and for some reason it's not working now. He's not really interacting with other peers. He's not responding well to all the interventions you presented before. what would be your recommendation? What's the next step?
If from my experience, what I've noticed when therapy is not working, a lot of times is like I mentioned, there's so many contributing factors. But in terms of ABA, we may not have a strong reinforcer in place, right? There may not be MO, there may not be motivation, right? I think that's one of the biggest barriers, right, for treatment to be effective. That's one of the biggest barriers. Number two, one of the biggest barriers is also how consistent is therapy outside of therapy sessions, right? So like therapy takes place one-to-one, but we're with an individual on a long day, on a long session, we're 4 or 5 hours. I mean, I have 2-hour sessions, right? But then the child or the individual is with mom, dad, family, the rest of the day. And if there's no consistency across the board, right, in different settings, then those 2 hours or those 3 hours that I spend are not going to be as effective in behavioral change, right? So I think there's several barriers when it comes to effective treatment. Definitely not having a strong reinforcer is a big one. Not having consistent treatment implementation outside of therapy is another huge barrier. I think not having a multidisciplinary approach like we talked about is a huge barrier as well, because it may be that the reason the treatment is not working is because you're not providing the right type of treatment, right? And because you're not aware of all the other variables that are affecting that behavior, right? So I think that's why, multidisciplinary approach for me is so important. So there's definitely several barriers when it comes to that. And I think if you have a situation like that, you have to maybe come in and like start from scratch and see like, okay, I need to maybe refer out or maybe even collaborate with someone who can give me a different perspective, right? And identify behaviors that I'm not identifying or antecedent variables that need to be accounted for that are not taking place right now. But there's so many variables, right? There's so many variables, but those are kind of the few barriers that I see in my experience that have been, the most difficult to break through, right? Consistency across the board, not having a strong reinforcer, no MO, so the individual is like, no, I'm just clocking in and clocking out. When you come in, I'll wait until you leave, and then when you leave, I get back to doing what I do, right? And then, I mentioned the consistency across the board. I can't mention that enough, right? The parent involvement, staff involvement. If there's no therapy taking place in school, then there has to be coordinated care between the teacher and the therapist, so that when he's at school, same treatment implementation strategies would be taking place there. And he gets home, and then there's parent coaching taking place because now mom is, implementing the same type of stuff, and there's consistency across the board, so that he can really create new associations like we talked about and create new learning history. Like, oh, okay, this is how it's going to be across the board, right? This is how things are now moving forward, right? So I think that's one of the few things that was worth mentioning for sure. Yeah.
Another question as
Yes,
well.
of course.
So, being that in this setting, this is a church, and a lot of us come here, and we're part of the community, we're family members, or we may know somebody with autism. What is a way that anybody that doesn't have an autistic child could help? Let's say a family member comes in here, and how would you tell us what is, I know it's not a, black or white answer, but what would be an approach to make that child feel welcome, and, we can also assist the family in such way that they feel, helped?
So in this example, we're basically helping a family that's coming in. They're coming new into everything that's related to ABA therapy and autism spectrum, right, as a whole, right? So I think the biggest thing I feel would be to reach out to different practitioners like myself, right, to get some information. I think there's many people that are willing to share knowledge and information to try to help. And I think it's really becoming an expert in the condition in ABA, right? And sometimes, and I say this because myself, I've applied ABA for my mental health, right? So, and when I was working in becoming a board certified behavior analyst, there were situations for me that were disruptive and they were difficult for me to handle emotionally, like whether it was fear, anxiety, things from conditioning histories that I had, upbringing and things like that were playing a role. And I didn't know how to change some of the patterns that I had. I didn't know how to kind of create desired outcomes for myself. But then I call, the entire time I'm like, I'm working with children, I'm working with families, I'm using this learning science, but I'm not applying it on myself. So I had to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, like, how can I turn this around and really apply it, to myself? But I realized that in order to do that, I had to really kind of become an expert myself in it, right? Because many times I reached out to different people, right? Many times I reached out to, whether it was a psychologist, whether it was a therapist, and I didn't find a lot of help, right? When it came to that type of stuff. So I decided myself to, I'm already in the science of psychology. I'm already, working as a behavior analyst. How can I kind of use this same learning science to help myself, right? And I had to really dive into it and become almost an expert in everything related to anxiety, fear, right? Trauma, right? Things like that, things that we carry from our child. Like, I'm stepping into mental health here now, but things that I was carrying myself that were reflecting as behaviors and poor patterns. And I had to really dive myself into those type of topics. So I think with a parent that is new to the field of autism, or their child is just diagnosed with autism, I think is trying to suggest for them to become experts. There's so much information, evidence-based journal articles out there and online, always evidence-based, and really diving into what autism looks like, what the spectrum really is about, how everyone is a unique learner, right? And trying to, it's almost like if you want something done well, you have to do it yourself type of deal. And it's one of those things where you have to be very mindful and you have to be very knowledgeable in that sense if you want to get good behavior analytics services, right? So that's the first step, is educating yourself so that when you do seek behavior analytics service, you're able to identify what is good service and what's not good service. Because when you come into it, if you don't have a foundation, right, then anyone could just step into your home and tell you X, Y, and Z, and you're gonna follow it because they're the expert and you're just kind of following them, right? It's kind of like when I reached out to a psychologist or when I reached out to someone and they just said, oh, it's just anxiety, just take some pills, right? And it's like, oh, okay, that's cool. But then when I saw that wasn't working, it's like, oh, I gotta do something different, right? Maybe I gotta same idea, right? So it's, sharing that information with the person, become an expert in it, I have foundational knowledge and understanding of it so that when you do seek behavior analytics service, you're able to identify, hey, this is what ABA should be about. And no, this is not what it should be about, and this is not what it looks like, and this is not what I want for my son because children on the autism spectrum, this is common and this is not, right? Having that information will allow you to identify what's good service and what's not good service, which can ultimately result in good outcomes for your child, right? So I hope that answers your question. That would be my biggest suggestion. Just dive into the topic yourself and try to become an expert at it. Again, thank you guys so much for joining me here today. I flew in from Miami. I was in the city. And just to be able to, I did some work earlier in the week, and then, thank you to Joanna. Joanna, really made this happen. And it was just, the setting was perfect. I feel like this is really kind of like my purpose, is really to be here and be of help, and try to really break things down in a way that is relatable to everyone. Try to provide information that is not going to, a lot of times, a lot of information that we see out there they do it in a way to benefit someone else, but not the consumer, right? And for me, is I want to try to provide information that is going to be in the best interest of everyone that is looking to get the help, right? So I think, yes, of course.
Really appreciate you being here tonight.
I appreciate it.
And we just hope that we can bring you,
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
We certainly hope that we can have you here again, and that
sure.
we can spread the word and get more people in the community, outside of the community, exposure to your wealth of knowledge that you've been able to bless us with tonight.
I appreciate you so much, man. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Those kind words, and I think that was really the goal. I spoke to Joanna earlier, and I was like, look, my goal is really to just be here, even if we just record myself the training and we could just share this training with people, then maybe, we can create, a big group, and I'll be back, and then we can do some more work for sure. Yeah. I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
And what an incredible presentation. I was sure blessed by it. I cannot wait to go back and review, because you gave a lot of nuggets, a lot. And another thing I want to say, please follow him. His Instagram is myABAcoach. In Instagram, he has a lot of, he's a motivational speaker as well. He's very into sports, and he does put his little videos up there in regards to his ABA. Again, is myABAcoach in Instagram, and that is his email, myabacoach@highherbx.com, okay? One more thing before we conclude this night. Give yourself a hand of applause for being my audience, for coming here, all right? And before the night is over, I want to give a special thank you to my pastors, right? Pastor Rob and Pastor Merle, right? The whole entire House of Worship family, everyone that came here, everyone that spread the word, everyone that donated something, everyone that was involved in this event. For Jonathan, for his family being out here, his kids, it's definitely been a blessing. And hopefully we see you very soon. And yes, and thank you guys. Have a good evening.